Okay, so what I want to do with this first little mini video lecture is show you an application of what you've been studying. You've been working through some problems about supply and demand, and particularly using supply and demand to analyze tax incidence. Right, so you've been working through how do you show where the burden of a tax falls, whether it falls on producers and consumers. And I want to make the pitch that when you teach this stuff, when you're in your classroom, you really want to work hard to find applications that are relevant to your students. Okay, so I have an application that I think will be relevant to you. So you are all teachers, you are educators, and so we are going to look at the market for education. And this one is exciting to me as well because this is what I study, right? This is what I do for a living. I study the economics of education, right? So we're going to set up a market for education. And actually, before we get going on this, let's just think for a moment, is it appropriate to think about a market for education? And I would posit that it is. Okay, so I'm going to argue that education really is a private good. So think back to your intro classes and that you defined a private good as something that is both excludable and rival. Excludable and rival. Okay, to be a public good, it had to be non-excludable and non-rival. And although education is provided publicly, we generally provide it publicly for reasons of equity, not for economic theory reasons. Okay, because education is excludable, you can shut the door and keep people out. And it's rival in the sense that if you have a classroom of 600 people, it's a different quality of education than you have a classroom of only 6 people. Now, it's a fascinating topic, and we could get on a bit of a tangent here, because, for instance, this class that I'm providing now is not rival, right? We can add people as much as we want, and we don't diminish the experience whatsoever, which is really behind this idea of MOOCs and the likes. So, like I said, I can talk about this and get excited about it and take it in many different directions. And I guess what I'll leave this with is that you should pick something that you're excited about and you think your students are excited about and use that to really motivate these models and motivate why we think this is interesting. Okay, so we're in the market for education. Perhaps it's easiest just to think about it in terms of private education, okay, to sort of force the fact that it's a private good. So you can think of this as private higher ed, or in the case of school vouchers, it's more common to think about like a K-12 system. Okay, so we're going to think about vouchers. Okay, our policy shock here, what's going to change and shock us out of equilibrium is we're going to introduce a new policy, which is going to be a voucher. Okay, so before the vouchers get introduced, we have an equilibrium price and an equilibrium quantity. And let me also stress for a moment that it's important to go slow and to talk your students through what's going on with the model here. Okay, so let's just go slow. What we see here is that in equilibrium, before the vouchers get introduced, we see some level of students who are choosing to go to private school. Okay, so the quantity here is the number of seats, the amount of enrollment, the number of students who are choosing private schools instead of public education. And we see an equilibrium price as well. So what is this equilibrium price? This is the tuition that gets charged. Now I know tuition varies at all sorts of different private schools, charge different tuitions, but here we're making the assumption, as we often do, that we're talking about a market for relatively homogeneous goods, right? That private education is roughly the same no matter where you go, and there's sort of this average price that gets charged, okay? So now let's add vouchers and see what happens. So the vouchers are a subsidy. So here's the connection to what you've been doing in your reading and in those problem sets that I had you work through. So instead of a tax, and a tax would be where the government is taking money from firms or taking money from consumers, here we have a subsidy where the government is giving money to firms or giving money to consumers. And in fact, that's exactly where I want to start. I want to start with this question of, should the government give the money to the students? Right? Should they give it to the families? Should the voucher be something that's like a coupon that the families, the household has, and that they get to use wherever they want? Or should we conceptualize the voucher as something that goes to the firm, or in this case, the school? Right? Is this something where the government just directly subsidizes private education by giving the schools money for each student they enroll? And I'll cut to the chase here before we start graphing. It doesn't matter. Okay? The big conclusion from this analysis is going to be that it does not matter if you give the subsidy to the parents or if you give the subsidy to the schools. The end result is exactly the same. Okay? So let me show this. So let's start. Actually, I think I can clean this up a little bit. There we go. Let's start by putting the subsidy in the hands of the consumer. Okay. So what will this do? This will increase the demand for education. Okay. So this will push out the demand curve. And in fact, here we know exactly how much the demand curve will shift out. It'll shift out by exactly the amount of the voucher. Okay. So this shift, this upward shift, will be exactly equal to the voucher. Okay. So at every point here, this is the amount of the voucher. So effectively what we're saying is that consumers would pay what they used to pay, plus now they get this discount. Okay. Now what I want you to notice here, though, is that the equilibrium that gets established, let's just clear this up so it doesn't get too busy to look at. The new equilibrium that gets established right here gives us a new price and a new quantity. Okay, so let's just call that new quantity, new price. And we see already some conclusions, right? So we already see some policy outcomes here. And the first policy outcome, I think, is one that the policymakers intended. We see that when you introduce a voucher, you get more students going to private school. Okay? You get more students attending than would have in the absence of the voucher. Although if we're sort of nuanced and careful here, we notice that the price has also gone up. Okay? And if the price had not gone up, okay, bear with me for a second, if the price had not gone up, the quantity demanded, in fact, would have been much higher. So we see an increase in quantity, but not by as much as policymakers would have hoped. Okay? And what's the difference here? Well, some of the voucher translates into higher prices. Okay, so we also see a new higher price than we did without the voucher. So some of the voucher, some of the subsidy is in effect captured by the schools. Even though we put it in the hands of the consumers, the schools end up reaping some of the benefit. Okay, so the price goes up, but the price does not go up by the full amount that it would have, right? We get this equilibrium effect instead. Okay, let me back up for a second. What I want to show you here, though, is that this new price that gets charged, okay, the new tuition that the schools charge, the consumers don't actually pay that full amount, right? They might pay that sticker price, but then remember they have this voucher, right? They have this V. So then we have the price, the new price. Whoops, that's really hard to read. It's a little tricky to write on these screens. All right, so we've got our new price. That's no better. Anyway, that says new, minus V for voucher. Okay. So we have here a difference between the price that the tuition price, the sticker price, the price the suppliers get to keep, and the price that the consumers actually end up having to pay. And so what we can do here is kind of divvy up the change and show that the consumers benefit and the firms benefit as well. Okay, so specifically, I'm trying to use a lot of colors here, this new higher price, okay, so we'll call this increase in price a benefit that accrues to the producers, in this case the schools. The schools get to charge a higher price and they benefit. And then because the voucher subsidizes or acts like a coupon for the consumers effectively pay a lower price. Okay? So some of the subsidy, right, this full amount V gets split. So some of the subsidy goes to producers and some of the subsidy goes to consumers. All right, just to recap here, we started an equilibrium, we added a subsidy that increased the demand because we put the subsidy in the hands of the households. That pushed up the price. So in some ways, the firms benefited, an unintended consequence of the voucher. We had hoped that the voucher would stay in the hands of the consumer, that they would bear the full benefit. But some of the benefit was captured by the firms, in this case schools. some of the benefit did stay with the consumers. Right? And in the end, we do see more students going to private school, although not as many more as we would have hoped, right, as the policymakers might have thought. All right, so then let's move on here and do a very similar analysis, only in this case, we'll start an equilibrium, right, and we'll start with an equilibrium price. We're still in the market for private education. And before the voucher gets introduced, we have an equilibrium price and quantity. Okay? And then we're going to add this voucher in here. When we add the voucher in here, let's give the voucher to the schools. Let's say, it was weird what happened in the last analysis. The schools were capturing it. Well, maybe it's just more efficient to give the voucher directly to the schools anyway. What would happen then? Well, if we give the voucher directly to the schools, we're going to see an increase in the supply. Okay? And again, the difference here between the old supply and the new supply, this is going to be exactly equal to the amount of the voucher. Okay? The supply curve is going to shift by the amount that we subsidize. You can think of this as they can produce at their old levels, plus now they get this bonus, they get this extra income, which allows them to produce additional amounts. Okay? And as before, we reach a new equilibrium, and not surprisingly, it says new, we see more students going to private school than we would have otherwise. Okay, that's the intended effect. We get an increase in supply and we get more students attending. However, we also get a price effect. Okay? And here we see that the new price is lower than what it used to be. But remember, the schools also get this voucher. They also get subsidized for every student they enroll. So effectively, the schools get the new price plus the voucher. Okay? And again, we see that the reality of the situation then is that the benefit of the voucher, the subsidy, gets split. Okay? The producers benefit because they get to charge a lower price but then reap the benefit of the voucher. Okay? And so effectively they're bringing in more money per student and they're bringing in more students. And we also see that the consumers benefit because there's a lower tuition price. The sticker price goes down. So although the voucher never lands in their hands, although they never get it as a coupon, they get the benefit of a lower tuition price. All right. So the takeaway here I want you to notice is that the same thing happened whether or not we gave the voucher to the families or to the schools. In both cases, more students attended private schools, and the voucher, the benefit was split between the schools and the families. Okay? Some of the benefit accrued to the private schools themselves, and some of the benefit accrued as intended to the families. Okay? So what your book recommends, and I think is a great idea, is not to worry too much about whether the voucher is applied at the school level or at the household level, and to take advantage of the fact that the conclusion is the same either way, and to just draw this wedge. Okay. When it's a tax wedge, you draw it on the other side of the equilibrium here, but with a subsidy it comes in on this side. Okay. And what the wedge does is just sort of clean up the graph a little bit and just draw our attention to the fact that the price paid by consumers, right, reading off the demand curve here, ends up being different than the price received by the suppliers. Okay? And the difference is the amount of the voucher. Okay? So the price the suppliers get is the price the consumers pay plus the voucher. And what this does is it makes it a little bit cleaner, a little bit neater, but we can still see, right, that here's our old equilibrium, and we still see that the tax incidence, or in this case the subsidy benefit, is shared. Right? The producers reap some of the benefit, and the consumers reap some of the benefit. So now we can tinker with it just a tiny bit more, okay, because it starts to get even more interesting if you play around with the elasticity of supply and demand. So up until now, I drew it with our sort of standard X, right, that sort of ubiquitous shape where supply and demand are sort of relatively sort of normal elasticity. I don't know, whatever that means. But what if we drew a more extreme case? Okay, so for instance, what if we said that the supply of private schools is really quite inelastic? This would mean that schools really aren't very price responsive. They sort of have the number of seats that they have, and whether or not they can charge higher tuition, right? They can't build more classrooms, hire new teachers immediately, and they're constrained. Okay, so at least in the very short term, I think it's reasonable to assume that the supply will be relatively inelastic or relatively fixed. Okay, and we'll draw demand sort of more normal, so to speak, here. Right, and now let's put that subsidy in here. Okay, and notice that what happens is that when supply is relatively inelastic, right, the price that the consumers end up paying doesn't change all that much. Okay? And that whether or not the voucher is applied to the family or to the school, it is the school, the producer in this case, that reaps most of the benefit. Okay, we have a very small benefit that accrues to the consumer. So again, to recap, if schools cannot change quantity very much, okay, we're not going to see a very big increase in the number of students attending. Right, so maybe that's the first, sorry, those are not very straight lines. But we see that as predicted by the fact that supply responses are inelastic, we don't see much of a change in quantity. And so because there's not a lot of change in quantity, okay, most of the voucher is captured by the producers in the form of higher tuition. Okay. Very little of the benefit accrues to consumers or households in the form of lower costs. So the elasticity now adds to our discussion and makes it all the more nuanced. And I'll leave it to you to sort of play around with what would happen if the demand is relatively inelastic. Right? How would that change the conclusions? And really think through not just the math, not just the graph, not just the numbers of it, but the intuition behind it and whether that makes sense. And I'm going to leave it there because we're going to move over to the voice thread setup. Okay, so you're going to move into the voice thread discussion, and we're going to pick up with a discussion amongst the other people in the class about this and other education policies. Okay, so I will leave you with the plea that when you're teaching supply and demand, try and use an example that you think will be interesting to your students, that's interesting to you, something you're passionate about, and something that can lead to discussion. Because it'll really show your students that these models are useful tools and not just abstract ideas.